The first disability-specific institution in the United States was created in 1817. It was then called the Asylum for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, and it is now known as the American School for the Deaf. In 1818, the McLean Hospital, then called the McLean Asylum for the Insane in Massachusetts, was opened. Over the next century, nearly 500 institutions would be created to house and treat people with disabilities. This movement to institutionalize coincided with the era of rapid industrialization, particularly in the northern states. And this was a process in which human labor was linked to wage earning, and American communities changed as cities swelled in size. Public schools developed as a means to provide widespread education, and this was also useful in producing workers who were sufficiently ready for the workforce. But what about people whose intellectual or physical needs did not fit within the existing models for schools or factories? This is where the asylums came in. If one could not learn in school like others or work in the factory, then this was judged a problem, and it needed to be isolated and examined and corrected, or at least confined, hence the rise of the asylum in the United States. Those who could not function in this newly emerging and expanding environment were now considered abnormal and deviant, requiring medical treatment to fix. Concerns about this are also reflected in the U.S. Census, which began to track disability in the 19th century. But what rights do people have who are in these institutions and under the care of the medical experts? Well, in 1860, Elizabeth Packard was committed unwillingly to an institution by her husband, and she was kept there for 3 years before she was able to secure her own release. She was able to win a lawsuit to gain her freedom. And then she became an advocate for the rights of people in institutions. To garner public attention, she turned to the written word, sharing her story as an exposé of the institutions, the first of many such narratives that we'll discuss in this course. Her advocacy led to the creation of the first state law to require a public hearing for inmates and for their right to use the postal system so that they could be in contact with the outside world. Again, this is before the internet, but this at least gave them access where there was none before. Packard's work reminds us that these institutions, regardless of the good intentions, were poorly funded, and those in them faced abuse and exploitation of all kinds. Forced to work to cover the budgetary shortfall, sexually abused, deprived of food, tortured, used for medical experiments, and even killed, with almost no repercussion. Now, it should at least be noted that smaller private institutions for those who had greater financial means did offer somewhat better care than these larger public institutions. Now, one of the results of the warehousing of people with disabilities was a growing understanding of different manifestations of disability. The institutions separated deaf and blind students into different institutions, and they began to distinguish between those who we would say today had developmental disabilities from those who were labeled insane. That is, we see the emergence of medical classification of aspects of disability that didn't exist before. By the 1930s, the U.S. had nearly 500 institutions with some 550,000 people with disabilities. It was deemed more humane to put a child with developmental or cognitive disabilities into an asylum than to raise the child in your home. It was considered better for the state to take custodial care, removing them from mainstream society and from your own family. Removing was the order of the day. In those expanding cities throughout the nation, a new kind of legislation emerged, commonly referred to as ugly laws, which were used to remove what was deemed unsightly from the public sphere, including anyone with visible disease or disability. Now, these were often combined with anti-begging laws, revealing an obvious distinction between deserving and undeserving people with disabilities. A middle or upper class man with a disability going about his business was fine, but a poor version of the same was illegal and could be subject to the ugly laws. There was an important exception, though. There was one place where the public wanted to see people with disabilities, and that was a cultural phenomenon that emerged in the 19th century that was then known as the freak show, which exploited the bodies of people with disabilities for public entertainment. An example of this can be seen in the shows of P.T. Barnum that appeared in museums and fairs and traveling exhibitions, and these remained popular up through the first half of the 20th century. To recap, the institution became a primary location around which disability was understood in the 19th and much of the 20th century. It was where people with disabilities were regularly separated from the community at large, and in this process, it helped to cement a medical definition for disability in the public's mind. That disability was a matter of physical and mental deficit requiring medical expertise, and that it was a social problem, which institutions and regulations aimed to cure or at least to control.